Ukraine signalling its much anticipated counter-offensive is nearing as preparations come to an end. In comments over the weekend, President Volodymyr Zelensky wouldn't give an exact start date for obvious reasons, but one thing is clear: the move will likely mark a pivotal moment in the war. CNN's Nick Payton-Walsh with more from Zaporizhia.
On increasing signs that Ukraine's counter-offensive, something which is of utter strategic importance to them, but they've said they will not announce the beginning of, signs that perhaps the prelude of it, or even it in itself, is beginning to get underway. For the past week, we've heard reports of explosions in the east of occupied Kherson and along the Russian-held bank of the Dnipro River. There have been reports of Ukrainian forces potentially landing in very small numbers. Is that a distraction? Is that something in earnest? Ukraine very keen not to confirm any of these reports or suggest that anything conclusive is underway. But in the past days, we've seen attacks on Novakhovka by Ukrainian strikes, artillery possibly taking out key Russian infrastructure. Also in Melitopol, another Russian-occupied town, there have been reports of explosions as well. And on top of that too, Sevastopol in occupied Crimea were hit by a drone, according to Russian occupying officials there, that caused a devastating series of explosions across a vital diesel depot there. That's so important for Russia's naval presence on that occupied peninsula. Enormous damage caused that took hours for firefighters to put out. And another example of how Ukraine at this point is able to hit vital parts of Russia's supply line in occupied areas, and that will take a heavy toll on its military's ability to function, to push back. We heard a bizarrely pointed warning from Yevgeny Prigozhin, a very public Russian figure involved in the war, the head of the Wagner mercenary group, saying, and I paraphrase here, that they're so low on ammo being supplied around Bakhmut, that symbolic city, that they potentially risk having to pull back or lessen their forces in there unless they get a lot more fast, pointing the finger certainly again at Russian defence chiefs, and also warning that there may be a catastrophe if they're not given what they need quickly. Now, he's made misleading statements before and provided little evidence, but it's bizarre to hear this sort of warning at this particular time when Russia is facing a potentially very decisive Ukrainian military move. We don't know when it will happen, we don't know where it will happen, but it is certainly beginning to build in anticipation and anxiety and tension ahead of it. Nick Payton-Walsh, CNN, Zaporizhia, Ukraine.
And joining me now is retired Australian Army Major General Mick Ryan. He's also a former commander at the Australian Defence College and author of War Transformed, the Future of 21st Century Great Power Competition and Conflict. Always good to see you, Mick. What might this counter-offensive, whenever it begins, look like in terms of objectives and tactics?
Well, g'day, Michael. I think what we're going to see is not one big push. We're going to see lots of different offensives in different areas. And the Ukrainians will be wanting to confuse, to deceive, to surprise the Russians around where their main effort might be, but also around where their logistics, their firepower, and all these things that are supporting their offensives are located.
You and I discussed at the beginning of the conflict, and have since as well, that taking territory is different to holding territory. Given that, what then would be the main benchmarks of success? And I know there's more than one.
Yeah, certainly. I think we need to have a clear view of what will look like a successful offensive. Firstly, the Ukrainians do need to take back their territory. They want to liberate their citizens and take back their sovereign territory, but they're also going to have to capture or destroy Russian forces to ensure the Russians can't undertake counterattacks or pose a future threat for the rest of this year. Finally, the Ukrainians will have to ensure that their own people, but also politicians and citizens in the West, see a successful offensive. So they're going to have to communicate what's going on and communicate a successful offensive in that reality.
Yeah, to keep up that all-important Western support, if for nothing else. Russia has known this was coming, of course, and they spent a lot of time bolstering defences, an array of barriers. There are these huge trench networks we've seen, particularly along the southern front. They've been rearming and so on. How then is the Russian posture looking in terms of defending this counter-offensive?
Well, the one thing about all these defensive works they've been undertaking is they're static. They're easy to pick up, and they're easy to target with precision munitions. and they're only as good as the troops who are manning them. If they're watching the obstacles and covering them with direct and indirect fire, that will be the case for some of them. But I think too the Russians will also have mobile reserves, which the Ukrainians will probably be wanting to target before the offensives, and that may be some of these explosions we're seeing over the past week.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned at the beginning there, and let's talk more about it. You know, despite the Russian defences, which are impressive, I mean, it's only fair to say they're as good as the troops holding those positions and the officers commanding them, ability-wise, but also morale-wise, which you've talked about before. And these are areas in which Russia has regularly failed during the war.
Yeah, they certainly have, and they haven't got any better as the war gone on. I mean, mobilised troops are a lower quality of many of those who initially invaded Ukraine, and these troops know they're not defending their own homeland. They're not defending their own people or their own towns. They're defending territory that's been captured illegally. So, you know, their motivation for staying and fighting will be under question, and it will be interesting to see how long it is before the Russian defences breaks before this rain of fire and steel that's coming at them from the Ukrainians.
A major offensive takes weaponry, but we've also heard Ukraine, they've pled for more weaponry, but at the same time they've been using it up at a prodigious rate, just holding the Russians at bay, particularly in the east. Do they have the materiel to make a sustained push, and do they know how to use it?
Well, they've certainly received a lot of material over the last 14 months, and whilst they've used a lot of it, you know, the Commander-in-Chief Zaluzhny in an interview in December made it clear they were also hoarding material for the offensives to come. They've also received a lot since Christmas, and they've been training quickly. And one thing the Ukrainians have proven since the very beginning of this war is they're very quick studies. They're quick to absorb new weapons and new equipment, and to use it in creative ways we may not thought of. I think they're going to surprise us and surprise us pleasantly, and the Russians unpleasantly, in these offensives to come.